Hey guys, this is your host, Doug Stewart, and if you have been with us since episode 1, I want to thank you for hanging in there with us and being a loyal supporter and a loyal listener. We have so many episodes. I mean, we're in the mid to high 300s right now, depending on which episode you're listening to this little pre-roll for. What we're going to do is we're going to actually re-release a few of the episodes that I would consider maybe our greatest hits, ones that maybe you haven't listened to in a long time because you've been here with us from the beginning, or maybe you haven't actually been here for that long and you haven't had time to go back and re-listen to some of them. So we're going to reissue some of the episodes that were really, I'm going to call them old as in like they were recorded a long time ago, but they're not old in terms of relevancy. And so you'll hear from me as host. You'll also hear from probably Norman Horn as host. We might even have some other special guest hosts depending on what the topic is. So to be sure, we will also be releasing new episodes, but we also wanted to return to some of the classics that we've had. So I'll let you get to this show.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
For today's episode, I am joined by Dr. Norman Horn, and we are going to have just a discussion about some basic libertarian principles. It's been a long time since we've sort of had a discussion, Norm, about some of the just what do libertarians believe and why do we believe some of the foundational principles that we believe in. So we're just going to have a conversation tonight.
Sounds like fun. Let's do this.
So this is a kind of common question a lot of people might get is like, well, what's the fundamental principle that libertarians believe? Or like, what does this all come down to at some point? Because there's so much out there that's like, libertarians believe this, libertarians believe that. And, if we boil it down, it means what?
Yeah, it's interesting that you might find that there's still some people out there that don't really get it, and they haven't heard much about what libertarianism is and what it entails. So if we were, just approached by some random guy on the street, and because that's always happens when I walk down the street, is that somebody just, out of the blue just asked me, hey, dude, what is a libertarian and what do you believe? Because every time that happens to me, I say, well, the fundamental thing that we care about is a consistent application of the non-aggression principle.
What's the non-aggression principle?
Yeah, what's the NAP? What's the non-aggression principle? Or sometimes you'll hear it called a few other things, the non-aggression axiom or whatnot, but it's more just the NAP for that matter. And what is that? What is a non-aggression principle? Well, in short, the non-aggression principle states that aggression is prohibited. That is, the initiation of force or fraud against someone else is prohibited. That is the fundamental thing that is against natural law. And why do we believe that? I mean, why is aggression the big deal anyway? Well, and if we care about certain things about civilization itself, if we care about peace and prosperity and in progress and improving oneself and having voluntary interactions with one another, then if we want those things to occur, then it all kind of boils down to this idea that the initiation of physical force or fraud is what's the problem with these types of or problematic interactions or whatnot. If we care about property, if we care about all of peace and the way we interact with one another, then we have to oppose the initiation of force. Of course, that means that if it kind of entails right off the bat that if there is initiation of force is wrong, well, what about other forms of force? Is there a place for responsorial force in some way? Yeah. And in fact, if one is initiating force against someone else, then the response to that might be self-defense. And that is not prohibited. So we understand that as being kind of the way in which it works. And it doesn't mean you necessarily have to go through some sort of self-defensive measure. And in fact, a lot of times, when it comes down to it, there are forms of aggression that warrant different types of responses. There's some things that may be aggression, but are not necessarily those things that you would respond with some type of massive response. If somebody is trying to break into your house and kill your family, well, then you have warrant to do some sort of responsory force to that may involve repelling the attacker with deadly force. That's not impermissible in the libertarian rubric. But there are other things that if somebody pushes you around as they're trying to move forward in a line or something like that. That might be aggressive, but it doesn't warrant shooting them in the face or something stupid like that. So while on the one hand, aggression can be understood in a variety of different arenas, we understand that there are degrees of it as well. And so that's kind of a high level overview of what one can imagine there.
So there are a number of ways to put or say to the random person on the street who asks you, hey, you stranger wearing a hoodie that says libertarianchristians.com, what do the libertarians believe? There are other ways to say it. You could say we believe in the non-aggression principle. Another way to say it could be like, well, we want human interactions to be based on consent and not on force. And consent is a very important term nowadays in the after the Me Too phenomenon. And, people on the left might actually kind of hear that and say, oh, consent. Well, I'm all about consent and I'm not about forcing, decisions on people. I'm all about choice. Well, one of the things that I think of when I think of the non-aggression principle and I think about how consent works, self-defense or the ability to defend yourself against somebody who has violated the non-aggression principle, that's why it's justified, is because they've violated the principle by which you hope they operate. And they've basically, in some sense, sort of, would you call it, they forfeited their right to be peacefully dealt with when they decide to violate the principle. Norm, is that kind of the way you would say it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And in fact, just a few weeks ago when we had Judge Napolitano on, he kind of used those exact words, I believe, to talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in sort of the broad picture of like, well, what about society? Like, well, there should be a presumption of liberty about individuals. They should be free to live as they see best for themselves, and they don't need justification to the rest of society. And so it's sort of the framework. It doesn't mean they can do whatever they want, because whatever they want might be aggressive toward others. But the restrictions on their freedom, we would say, are violations of their personal rights, and we'll talk about property rights here in a little bit. And so they're wrong unless they're somehow shown otherwise, and that can get too far afield. But we're really just kind of talking about the basics here.
Yeah, but what happens then? We could actually then go to what happens when somebody does violate this principle. The non-aggression principle. There's beyond just self-defense.
Yeah, well, you alluded to that. One is that you can react in self-defense, and we've had conversations about, how is it okay? I mean, should Christians be pacifists and things like that? You can go back and listen to those for that conversation. You can react in self-defense. You don't have to. Christian ethics would probably lead us to seek something like restitution rather than just retaliation or vengeance of some kind. But yeah, that is a really good question, because if somebody has violated the non-aggression principle, then there's an issue of justice, because we believe that individuals, as a matter of justice, should be left alone or should not be aggressed upon.
Right. But then there's also the, after the fact. Well, let's say someone has committed aggression against you or your property. What happens at that point? Beyond the active, okay, if it's happening right now, then I can engage in self-defense. If it's happened in the past, there is something that has been essentially broken, right. A principle. And so what happens there? And that's where we talk about, how do we deal with justice in this instance?
Yeah.
And the first principle of justice is, we like to say, is restitution to the victim. And that it's not merely a matter of simply just, okay, well, if somebody did something wrong, well, then you punish the heck out of them until they, feel sorry enough or something. But rather, the focus of justice is not on punishing the aggressor as much as it is restoring the victim to wholeness as best as possible. And that's I think the key difference between the way that we often think about justice in this case is that sometimes you envision, well, that guy just did something wrong, he just needs to be sent to jail. But that can actually become, there's actually can be compounding problems to even that sometimes. It doesn't mean that there's never a place for incarceration of some kind. However, it just seems kind of contradictory to think, well, okay, if this dude mugs Norman and steals his wallet, that's a bad thing. But then the way in which that's dealt with is not that Norman just gets his wallet back with some type of additional potential restitution on top of that, but that Norman is then taxed, and then the other guy is sent to prison, and the rest of society is actually getting taxed in order to make sure that guy is in prison or something to that effect. I mean,
I'm surprised, Norm, but I don't think I've ever thought about it that way before. Where now that there's one additional person in prison, or the fact that this is the method by which we put people in prison is because they burden us with their violations of aggression, or their aggressive acts, is that now we as society have to pay more just to keep them away from us.
Well, the irony of this too, and by the way, Doug, that's something that Mary Ruwart has talked extensively about in her works. I believe that it's in Healing Our World. In an Age of Aggression, I think that's the older version. The new version has a different subtitle, but
The Compassion of Libertarianism is the subtitle.
Right. Yeah. So I think she talks about that extensively, and you can find plenty more there. But yeah, that's the irony of it too, is that it turns out that that having the perpetrator actually participate in the restitution process of making the victim whole again is actually better for both sides. And there's actually some substantial research to suggest that is the case. And we really can't go through that here, but it exists. And you can kind of see why, because, think about, this is a really reduced example, right? But follow it for a second. If a couple of kids are playing around and one, steals the other's toy, it doesn't really do it. It doesn't necessarily do a lot of good if just pure punishment occurs. That might actually entail more alienation as a result than what has already been taking place. But if there is some restitution given to them, that not only is the child, give back the toy, but there's a means of communication that allows them to actually restore a relationship together, then you can imagine that actually is potentially a much better result. Now, granted, that is a much more reduced and simplified case than the more complicated ones of what happens when, like a guy breaks into a house or something like that. And certainly, we do not want to suggest that there's that should happen, that these types of things should happen in every situation. There are times where the victim would never want to be in the presence of that perpetrator again, and we would that's understandable. But some sort of restitutive process is often better for all parties concerned than the pure, well, let's just throw the perp in jail. And now it's kind of a double victimization process where now the original victim has to pay to make the other guy go away.
Yeah. Yeah, you think about the long arc of justice, the long game here, if you will, is wholeness and shalom. It's not just a matter of, you violated a law, so now you have to pay the price. Well, okay, fine. Restitution doesn't mean that there's no payment there. Restitution can be painful. It doesn't mean...
Yeah, if Doug steals my wallet, then I want to, and if Doug steals my wallet and then goes off, I might have to hire a private investigator or something to get my wallet back. And, or there may be, a variety of things that happen in order to restore me to wholeness again. And that may also involve that, well, not only do you give me my wallet back, but that guy has to now pay for the expenses to get it back. And that guy also needs to, provide some interest payment. I mean, there are ways in which we can rationally go about.
Or maybe he has to be your butler for life. That's a really old reference. If people get that, great.
Yeah. Wow. That's Okay.
Yeah. So there's so not to derail a serious topic with a innocent joke, but I just couldn't help myself. So this violation of the non-aggression principle is important for a number of reasons. One is that we believe that individuals are made in the image of God. We're deserving of respect, and we need to treat each other as we'd like to be treated. There's plenty of biblical values involved in there. But there's also an important concept with respect to individuals, and that has to do with property rights. And property rights become it can easily become kind of a convoluted topic, and people start talking about slightly different things when they argue over whether or not there's such a thing as property rights, whether or not property rights are kind of a modern invention. What does it mean to say that someone has a right to a property? Like, there can be a lot of like in the weeds sort of discussion. And, for a deeper discussion, one of the episodes we did was with Stefan Kinsella about intellectual property. And at the beginning of that, he kind of spells out some of the clarifications over what does it mean to have property.
Right.
But a question that a lot of people think of when they think of property is that, well, shouldn't we value people over property? And that feels good. But when you really kind of get down to what do people even mean by that, it's really kind of meaningless, because we have a right to ourselves. We have a right to our own bodies. And what we do with our bodies is related to property in some sense.
Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that when we talk about property rights, these are ways of just delineating the boundaries. The fact is that, there's no, just because some Marxist at one point or another told you that, well, property doesn't exist or something like that, it doesn't mean that they just suddenly dismembered, a principle that's gone on for millennia here or something like that. The notion of property rights has been attacked by a number of people, both common and great in stature over the last decades, and whether from the Marxists or currently in Congress for that matter. But the fact remains is that we have to have some way of delineating what ownership looks like. We have to have some way of doing that. And the uniqueness of libertarianism in many respects is our theory of property rights, in that it is concrete. It is very specific. It has, and it's the one that makes the most consistent sense of the world. And so every social theory out there has some understanding of property rights. The question is, how does it elucidate it? And libertarianism really is the best way of doing so. And what is that? Well, in short, we could say that we have a property right in ourselves. That is that because of whether or not you're coming at this from a Christian perspective or not, you could say that there is some inherentness to our humanity. Rights come from our humanity, and whether you say that comes from God or not, it still is part of the natural law. And as Christians, of course, we would say that this has to do with the fact that we are made in the image of God. And so as such, there is a very limited sense in which anybody else has anything that they can control us with. And in fact, we would say that, again, this goes back to this idea of the non-aggression principle itself, that we are free. We have the presumption of liberty. We are free to live as we see fit, so long as that we are not committing acts of aggression against other people. And those may come with consequences, of course, but nonetheless, we are free to do that. So if we have that property right in and of ourselves, that delineates what others can do, quote, quote, against us. Now, if that is the case, then in order to substantiate and prolong and flourish as our lives, then we have to also have some means of ownership over the means to do that. And so, because of the natural scarcity of the universe, where resources are scarce, we have to have means by which we can say, like, this is this resource has exclusive use by a particular person, and that's how we developed property rights in the first place. So that's really all it is. is that we have a particular theory about property rights, and that really comes down to, that exclusive use goes down to the first user, the first appropriator of that resource. And there's only a few ways one can even articulate that. It's like, okay, if somebody comes across a resource, it can only be allocated toward use in a few particular ways. One is that, well, it belongs to everybody somehow in some equal fashion, or else it's nonsensical. But that entails, tons of economic problems, and it doesn't really make any sense. You could say, well, it belongs to the last user. It belongs to the one who can fight it out best, or something like that. But then that involves contradictions as well, as to, well, then it's just a might makes right thing, and then we run up against the contradiction in how we own ourselves at that point. And then, but then the other one is simply, well, whoever was able to appropriate it first is the one who has the right, who has a property right in that resource, and then can trade it or do what he wills with it, so long as he's not aggressing or committing an act of aggression against someone else. And that's just how we do it. I mean, this is a very simple means of going about, but it's consistent, and it's consistent in how we apply it. The first user principle, or otherwise we sometimes will call that the homesteading principle, is just simply the simplest way and least it has no contradictions in it, of going about establishing a property right system. Now, again, this can be elaborated upon at length. And there are those who can do that a whole lot better than I can. Stephan Kinsella is one of the best people to go about it. And then, of course, Murray Rothbard, if you want to go back a little, earlier in writings about that in the libertarian tradition, that's a great way of that's a good resource for you there.
And I'm going to be the guy on the podcast who says yes, and admits, yes, libertarians do disagree somewhat on what the basis of property rights are, but you will not find a libertarian who would not say that property rights are an immensely important matter when discussing justice and political order.
I think that's probably fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
For the most part, we agree on the substantial points.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And whether or not they go to Stephan and Murray Rothbard, or whether they take a slightly different approach, I think there's, that's generally the way we would go about it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Hey, folks, I just want to take a break from our episode to ask you to consider becoming an LCI insider. We want everyone to feel engaged and excited about what LCI is doing. And the best way to do that is if you become a monthly supporter at $20 or more per month, you will become what we're calling our LCI insiders. You get some free gifts. You get an exclusive Christ is King magnetic lapel pin. They give you 2 copies of Faith Seeking Freedom. We send monthly ebooks months ahead of when they're released on our public website. You can get discounts on our swag on our online store, and you get exclusive invites to our quarterly live streams with the LCI staff. In addition to that, whenever we do publish something like a physical book like Strangers with Candy, we'll also send you those as well. So the best way to stay up to date on what we're doing and to support what the Libertarian Christian Institute is doing, including supporting the podcast you're listening to right now, is to become an LCI insider. So to do that, go to libertarianchristians.com/donate and then choose recurring monthly gift, and you'll be added to our list automatically. Thank you for your support, and I'll let you get back to the podcast.
What I think is interesting about the question of, self-ownership, we haven't used that word yet in this particular episode, is that when we talk about something like, well, we have a property in ourselves, or we have property rights, or we own ourselves and what we do with our own bodies, Christians will come along, even, Christians who kind of call themselves libertarians or want to be libertarians are still just kind of reconciling. But what about this? And this is the question. Doesn't God own everything? Can we really say that we own ourselves? And there might be verses that they bring up and say things like, well, we were bought with a price. I don't know the reference. We were bought with a price, and there might be a few others. Honestly, they're evading me now because I didn't write them down before the episode. So anyway, is it accurate to say that humans can own something that really belongs to God? And I think this is just kind of a big confusion over what we mean by ownership. And I have to think of it this way. I think of it like vertical versus horizontal, in the sense that I didn't create anything else in this world, and neither did you, Norm, and neither did anybody else listening to this. We didn't create in the same way that God created the world. We didn't create any of those things, and so we don't own them. We can't claim that. God can claim ownership over everything. Okay, fine. Well, now what? Like, that doesn't give me anything useful to say, well, God owns everything. Well, now what? What does that have to do with me and you? Does that mean that now that I believe that God owns everything, that I can just dictate what I get to say happens to Norman's property? That doesn't make any sense. So to say that God owns everything, well, yes, that's true. But when we're talking about political order, we're talking about how humans relate to one another. And as it relates to each other horizontally, I don't own you, you don't own me. And there's probably some rhyme I could have made up that made that sound even more poetic. But that's just it. Like it's just about relationship to each other. I don't own you, you don't own me. And so, to me, I see people doing this outside the kinds of people who are saying, well, wait, how does this square with this scripture? Well, what about the fact that God owns everything? Except for the people who are kind of genuine inquiry. A lot of times it just seems to me like a rhetorical strategy, like people who are just like, I believe God owns everything. Therefore,
it's a gotcha question.
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, since I believe God owns everything and the word of God says blah, 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 then we need to do blah, 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 things that I say God says in the Bible or whatever. I mean, because this could go off the rails really fast with a bunch of examples. So it's kind of, it's a gotcha question. It's a rhetorical trick to get people to play God because they don't like the fact that they don't own you.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. It's weird because when people use that, it's you'll see people both on the conservative and liberal side who will elucidate that type of rhetorical strategy, and I think that's just really kind of funny because it doesn't if they really believe that if you ask them, well, what are the ramifications of that, they might come up with completely different things.
Right. Yes.
And then the question is, well, which one of you gets to decide? Which one of you gets to order the other around? Right. Which one of you is the vicar of God here? Yeah.
Well, I mean, another thought along those lines is like, well, okay, well, if we are all owned by God, then none of us is God in order to play God over each other.
I don't think they really have much of a leg to stand on. For one thing, I think you're exactly right that the sort of horizontal versus the vertical relationship here is at play. That it's one thing to say that God's property claim over the universe is that He created it. Well, yeah, duh. That's great, but that doesn't really have that doesn't really elucidate very concretely what does that mean about yours and Doug's and Norman's relationship, about how Doug can order Norman's resources around in Norman's body.
It doesn't help us understand the political order and social structure and all of that. Yeah. Okay, that's true. Yeah. And I think there's obviously advantages in Christian testimony and things of that sort. But in terms of determining how we all relate to one another, it doesn't really solve the problem. Maybe there's some theological meaningfulness, if you will, to exploring that. But on a very basic level, there
is, though, on some level, and that's the the notion that we've brought this up in our podcast and in our works, our written works as well, about stewardship, and there is a fair question to be asked. It's like, okay, well, all right, so let's say that you do have all of God created us with this freedom. Yes, he is the ruler of the universe, but He created us as sub-creators, with part of that mission is to go and have dominion over the earth. And then what does that mean? Do we need institutions, or do we need some guide into becoming good stewards of this regard? And we get asked that. And the answer to that, of course, is, well, yeah, there are aspects of that. I mean, what else is the church if not an institution that helps to guide in our behavioral processes? I mean, come on.
Right. So maybe we should just make the state like the church and, implement good Christian policies, right? Isn't that what we mean? We need some overarching motherly system of motherly institution to make sure that we're all well taken care of and that we all just love each other. Right, Norm?
Well, not exactly.
Oh,
I mean,
okay. So we should just abolish institutions because, we're all just individual automatons. That's what libertarians believe, right?
See, now you've gone to the total polar opposites, and there is a balanced view that we try to bring forward as the result, right? So we believe in voluntary interactions, and so there is a place for a guide, but those are voluntarily held. So we work together in order to do these sorts of things, and we do that in a voluntary way. We don't need to execute force against one another in order to have well-established order. That's not required to get there. So I think that's really the balanced view, is that there are ways in which we can organize ourselves that don't require us to execute force against one another.
Yeah, I mean, and the gist of it, the point we're going to end on here, is that institutions matter because order is important. We started off here talking about non-aggression and individuals, and we begin thinking about, how does that works fine when I'm thinking about, Doug and Norman, or, Judge Andrew Napolitano with, the hundreds of people who see him on the streets of New York. How do they interact with each other? Well, they don't violate and they don't aggress and things like that. But what does that do in the big picture with millions and billions of people? How does this deal with social order? And we believe that institutions do matter. It does matter how society is organized. So we don't want to communicate that there's nothing to think beyond just, me and, one other individual or whoever I know. And so political order, and I use the word political order, maybe that's not the right word, order, societal order. Not as in there needs to be some sort of overarching institution to order society, but order without control is still order.
That's the beauty of human interaction. I mean, when we talk about in anarcho-capitalism or just voluntarism in our show, at various points, I think it's kind of, there's a certain sense in which the bulk of human interactions in the world today are completely anarchical in nature when you think about it. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's what's absolutely mind-boggling about the people who say, well, we need more, people need to be controlled. People don't know what's best for themselves. People will not behave well if you don't put massive control and laws in place. It's really? Do you really believe that? Yeah. Because if you think about it, the overwhelming majority of interactions are completely without any type of centralized control unit. There's nothing that's pushing people in place. We don't live in 1984 here. We don't live in Brave New World where those things are in place. And so all we would suggest as libertarians is that perhaps the boundaries of those interactions that can be completely without centralized control are broader than you might even think are possible. And so, that's really what we're gunning for here.
Yeah, another way to put it is you're already practicing anarchy in a variety of ways throughout your day. Now, I will say this: I could just imagine the critic here, in my the inner critic over my left shoulder saying, "But wait a second, you're doing those interactions peacefully and without fear of there's a lot of trust involved in the way that you interact with people when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the market, when you go buy stuff at various places. I guess that's the market. That if it weren't for institutions like the state, whether high state or local governments, municipalities and things, if there weren't police forces and some sort of system of justice involved that you just rely on, that you take for granted, you wouldn't have those quote unquote anarchic interactions that Norman just described. Now, I would concede that on the one hand, sure, except that doesn't prove the point that you need a top-down, ordered, structured society in sort of the 1984 kind of way. It means that there are institutions that don't need such things, because most of what we live by isn't just, oh, well, yeah, I'm glad the state has my back and they instituted all of these things. A lot of this goes back to the history of common law and how over the years and over the centuries, we've just assumed that there's just been like culture of trust built over decades and over centuries in especially in the West. And another thing that like it kind of, I wouldn't say proves the point, but kind of as an illustration, if for some reason right now, as you're listening to this episode, the Constitution, the original Constitution, and for that matter, let's just say every copy of the Constitution just somehow disappears or whatever, yeah, there'd be some sort of like, outrage and uproar and so forth. But it isn't like, oh
Call
my God.
Nicolas Cage.
You're right. Yeah, we couldn't let that pass.
I couldn't. Sorry.
Of course. No, it's fine. But here's the thing, like, we're not all going to be like, oh, well, now I can aggress against my neighbor. No, this is just part of who we are as a people. Now, again, I realize I'm talking as an American in general Western modern society. It's just kind of part of how we do things. And yes, there is a justice system in place that doesn't necessitate statism. It doesn't necessitate a large government. That's not what that's not what I'm talking about right here. But I guess the broader point here is that, yes, many of the interactions you do day by day don't need the state. In fact, things like the trust that you have, I'll just use an example here. The trust that you have that when you use a credit card to pay somebody, the trust that is involved there when you use a credit card especially is there's three parties involved. And if you don't have the funds, nobody goes to the government to figure that out and like come get you. It's your bank or your credit card company, which is a bank. It's not the state that comes after you. Yes, there's some infinite regress there. At some point, there is the state involved and so forth. But all of your interactions aren't predicated upon some system that is sort of enacted by the state alone.
Well, and the farther we progress in technological advancement and whatnot, the less and less the state is involved. Yeah. To such an extent that it's absolutely mind-boggling. And again, like I don't think we can. Yeah, the person who say, well, you have this background system in place. Like, oh, okay, like sure, but that doesn't prove. Like you said, Doug, that doesn't really prove the point that it's necessary. It just proves the point that it is. That's just the where we live now. That has nothing. Just because something is doesn't mean it should be, and just because something is doesn't mean
again. I don't want to sound like we don't have any respect for the way things are, and that we're just like we're not aware of the water we swim in, and we're not thankful for it, and so forth. Like of course, every day I am thankful for the institutions that people hundreds of years ago believed in, and some of them did fight for. But it doesn't necessitate the state, and especially ratcheting up the concentration of power, I think is kind of the direction that I would go when we talk about anti-statism. And as Norm said, like with technological advances, there are ways in which that we can foresee, and it might be our grandkids or great grandkids that actually kind of make this happen. It might be sooner than that, who knows, that we don't need to build. We don't need a central institution to establish the kind of order that we have long been used to, and honestly only been used to for several hundred years. For reference there, I'm just going to point listeners to the episode called "The Social Singularity" with Max Borders, and that book in and of itself is a great place to start.
I think in summary here, we can say people deserve to be free. People can be free. There is no need for a state, and there is no reason that we have to have that stuff in the background. That's really all it is.
Yeah, the presumption of liberty. We want interactions based on consent, not force. What's so bad about that, man? I mean, you've been on this 40-minute elevator ride with me, listening to me tell you about the non-aggression principle and its applications.
You asked for a 30-second answer and you got a lecture.
So if you want people to come up to you and say, hey, you're a libertarian, you can go to libertarianchristians.com/store and you can buy hoodies and other swag. and they'll just know that you're a libertarian.
Truly. Well, that is certainly something you can do. But we do appreciate everybody's support, and we hope that you do get something out of this. And that the next time that you're, talking to your friends or your family or that random guy on the street who asked you about your hoodie, a question about liberty, that you'll have at least a little more ammunition in your buckle to bring out for it. So thanks for sticking with us for this episode, and we'll be bringing you a whole lot more in the future like this.
Yep, there will be conversations like this in the near future. Rest assured.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
Hello, everyone. It's Doug from the Libertarian Christian Podcast. You might notice already that this recording sounds quite a bit different from usual. In fact, it probably sounds pretty crappy. Well, I'm doing this to show you something pretty amazing. As you might know, the guys over at Podsworth Media have been producing my show for several years, quite a while, hundreds of episodes. And now they have a brand new online app for taking rough recordings like this one and making them sound a whole lot cleaner and a lot more listenable in just a few easy clicks. So here are some of the core features. They remove background noise. It reduces plosives, which is really handy for me because I often forget to put my pop filter on before I do a YouTube video. Because pop filters look terrible when you're on camera. It fixes clipping. It removes clicks and pops. It evenly levels dialogue so that you don't have somebody talking really quietly and then somebody talking really loud because they're too close to the mic or too far away from the mic. It evenly levels dialogue so that you don't have somebody talking really quietly and then somebody talking really loud because they're too close to the mic or too far away from the mic. How do you use it? It's easy. You go to podsworth.com, you click Get Started, and because you're a listener to one of the Libertarian Christian Institute's podcasts, you can get 50% off your first order by entering the promo code LCI50. That's LCI50, and you will get 50% off your first order. If you are doing anything like a podcast, a video, a sermon, an audiobook, anything that's spoken word, you want to use podsworth.com and clean up your audio to be even more professional and polished. You want to use podsworth.com and clean up your audio to be even more professional and polished.